From New York, this is Democracy Now!
This landmark agreement includes the announcement of a $110 billion Saudi-funded defense purchase. And we will be sure to help our Saudi friends to get a good deal from our great American defense companies.
On his first overseas trip as president, Donald Trump signs a $100 billion arms deal with Saudi Arabia, despite the kingdom's ongoing atrocities in Yemen. We'll look at Trump's trip to Riyadh, his message to the Islamic world, as well as the election in Iran, where President Hassan Rouhani has been elected in defiance of Iranian hardliners.
Yesterday, you, the Iranian people, rejected the call of those who wanted to return us to the past and keep us in the same situation as before, and you helped push us forward.
Plus, we'll look at Turkey's crackdown on protests, not just in Turkey, but here in the United States. Last week, Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan looked on as members of his security detail assaulted a group of peaceful protesters outside the Turkish ambassador's residence in Washington. We'll speak with one of the protesters who is hospitalized. All that and more coming up. Welcome to Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. President Trump's visiting Israel today as part of his first trip abroad as president. During the two-day trip, he and Secretary of State Rex Tillerson will meet with Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and other top Israeli officials. It is Tillerson's first trip ever to Israel. In a controversial move, Trump is also slated to become the first sitting U.S. president to visit the Wailing Wall in Jerusalem. Trump's visit comes after widespread protests broke out Friday across the Israeli-occupied West Bank after a Jewish settler killed a young Palestinian on Thursday. More than 100 protesters were injured as Israeli security forces shot live bullets and tear gas at the thousands of demonstrators. The protests were also in support of the ongoing hunger strikes by Palestinians in Israeli jails. This morning, as Donald Trump arrived in Israel, 200 more prisoners reportedly joined the strike. Over the weekend, Trump visited Saudi Arabia, where he signed a series of arms deals totaling a record $110 billion. The arms deal includes tanks, artillery, ships, helicopters, missile defense systems, and cyber security technology. The deal is expected to total more than $350 billion over the next 10 years. It comes as the Pentagon continues to support a Saudi-led bombing campaign in Yemen, where years of fighting have decimated the country's health, water, sewage, and sanitation systems, contributing to a cholera outbreak that has killed at least 300 people, and that's threatening to spiral out of control. Over 10,000 people have died since the Saudi bombing campaign began in 2015. On Saturday, thousands of Yemenis rallied in Sana'a to protest the U.S. arms deal with Saudi Arabia and Trump's visit there. This is Yemeni journalist Nasser al-Rabi.
We are here today to say no for terrorism, no for American terrorism. And we are here to say to Trump, you kill Yemenis with Saudi hands. You support Qaeda ISIS by supporting Saudi Wahhabi regime.
A legal expert says the U.S. arms deal with Saudi Arabia may be illegal under U.S. law because of the Saudi bombing campaign's killing of civilians. As Trump celebrated the $110 billion arms deal, the Saudis pledged a series of investments in U.S. companies, including a $20 billion investment in the private equity firm Blackstone Group and a $100 million donation made along with the United Arab Emirates to a World Bank fund for women that was proposed by President Trump's daughter and White House advisor, Ivanka Trump. We'll have more on Trump's visit to Saudi Arabia after headlines with Code Pink's Medea Benjamin. On Capitol Hill, new details emerged Friday about the ongoing scandal over President Trump's firing of former FBI Director James Comey, including that President Trump called Comey a real nut job during his meeting with Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov and Russian Ambassador Sergei Kislyak earlier this month. Trump also reportedly told the Russian officials, quote, "I face great pressure because of Russia. That's taken off," unquote, referring to Comey's firing. Comey is slated to testify to the Senate Intelligence Committee after Memorial Day weekend, which coincides with Trump's return from his foreign trip to Saudi Arabia, Israel, and the Vatican. Trump had said he'd name a new FBI director before departing this past Friday, but the appointment's been delayed in part because possible candidates keep withdrawing their names from consideration. Among those who've withdrawn their names are former FBI official Richard McFeely, South Carolina Congressman Trey Gowdy, and former Assistant Attorney General Alice Fisher. Democrats are objecting to the possible appointment of former Democratic Senator Joe Lieberman as FBI director. Lieberman currently works for a law firm that had frequently represented Donald Trump. Meanwhile, the Washington Post is reporting a current White House official is under investigation for possibly colluding with Russian officials to allegedly hack the 2016 election. The White House official has not been named. A number of former Trump campaign officials, including former National Security Advisor General Michael Flynn and Trump campaign chair Paul Manafort, are also under investigation. In Indiana, more than 100 students marched out of the Notre Dame graduation ceremony to protest Vice President Mike Pence's commencement speech. Pence was chosen as the commencement speaker after thousands of students and professors signed a letter demanding the university not invite President Trump. After leaving the official graduation ceremony, protesting students held their own alternative graduation in a nearby park where they held hands and sang the Notre Dame hymn. Notre Dame, our mother, tender, strong, and true, proudly in the heavens. Among their issues was discrimination against Muslims. Vice President Pence was also the former governor and a congressman from Indiana. In Iraq, more than 50 people were killed in a string of suicide bomb attacks in the capital, Baghdad, and at checkpoints near the oil fields in the southern province of Basra on Friday. ISIS claimed responsibility for the Baghdad attacks, which killed at least 19 people. The attacks come as thousands of families continue to flee the fighting in Mosul, where the U.S. and U.S.-backed Iraqi militaries are battling to retake the city from ISIS. The United Nations says at least 435,000 people have been displaced from eastern Mosul so far. A new report by Human Rights Watch has accused troops allied with the U.S.-backed Iraqi military of detaining, interrogating, and torturing up to 100 residents as they fled the fighting in Mosul last month. The Syrian government says it's taken full control of Homs after thousands of anti-government rebels and residents were evacuated over the weekend. In 2011, Homs became known as the capital of the revolution when it was one of the first cities to rise up against the Syrian president Bashar al-Assad. In Iran, President Hassan Rouhani has been re-elected in a landslide. Rouhani beat out his challenger, hardline judge Ebrahim Raisi, in Friday's election, which saw huge turnout across Iran. Rouhani is credited with negotiating the 2015 Iran nuclear deal. He's now vowing to work for the removal of non-nuclear sanctions levied against Iran. We'll have more on the Iranian elections later in the broadcast. The New York Times reports the Chinese government jailed or killed as many as 20 CIA sources in the country between 2010 and 2012. U.S. officials call it the worst intelligence breach in decades. One CIA source was shot in public outside a government building in an apparent warning to others who might be working for the CIA. The New York Times reports it's still unknown how the Chinese successfully identified so many CIA sources. North Korea launched another medium-range ballistic missile test Saturday, only 1 week after launching a new type of rocket North Korea says is capable of striking U.S. military bases in the region. The UN Security Council is slated to meet Tuesday to discuss the North Korean nuclear program. In Brazil, protesters gathered in cities across the country Sunday to demand the resignation of President Michel Temer following explosive testimony released by the Supreme Court Friday that accuses Temer of accepting millions of dollars in bribes since 2010. On Saturday, Temer vowed not to resign, but key political groups, including political parties and the Influential Lawyers Association, have backed the impeachment calls. This is President of Brazil's Working Party, Rui Falco, at the protest on Sunday.
All over the country, people are taking to the streets today in defense of direct elections now. Temer's government has ended. He doesn't have the moral and political legitimacy to end the country's crisis. There are 14 million unemployed people already.
That's Rui Falco of the Brazil's Workers' Party. In South Sudan, the United Nations says pro-government forces killed at least 114 civilians in the last 6 months of last year and around the town of Ye. The UN also accused the pro-government soldiers of raping and torturing civilians. South Sudan has been racked by civil war since 2013, and the UN says parts of the country have entered a famine with 100,000 people at risk of starvation. Back in the United States, Billy Bush has broken his silence about the 2005 NBC's Access Hollywood tape, in which Bush is egging on Donald Trump as Trump brags about committing sexual assault.
I gotta use some Tic Tacs just in case I start kissing her. You know, I'm automatically attracted to beautiful. I just start kissing them. It's like a magnet. You just kiss. I don't even wait. And when you're a star, they let you do it. You can do anything.
Whatever you want.
Grab them by the pussy. Do anything.
NBC fired Billy Bush after the tape resurfaced during the 2016 presidential campaign. He had just become a co-host of The Today Show. In his first comments on the tape since its release, Bush told Good Morning America the tape brought his 16-year-old daughter to tears.
It was a powerful moment. My now 16-year-old daughter called me, and she was in tears. And she was really upset, and I said, Mary, it's going to be okay, you know, don't worry. And she said, no. Why were you laughing at the things that he was saying on that bus? Why were you playing along with that? It wasn't funny. I said, Mary, I am sorry, and there is no good answer for that.
In Washington state, authorities are investigating a possible nuclear waste leak after radioactive material was found on a worker's clothing. This comes less than 2 weeks after the Department of Energy declared a state of emergency at the Hanford nuclear site after a tunnel storing contaminated radioactive materials collapsed. Hanford is the nation's most polluted nuclear weapons production site. To see our full interview on Hanford when Democracy Now! Was in Washington state, go to DemocracyNow.org. In Maryland, the FBI is investigating the murder of an African-American student as a possible hate crime after police discovered his alleged killer was part of a white supremacist Facebook group called Alt-Right Nation. University of Maryland student Sean Urbanski, who's white, has been charged with first-degree murder for fatally stabbing 23-year-old Richard Collins II, an African-American student at Bowie State University who was visiting the University of Maryland during graduation weekend. Collins was set to graduate this spring. In Ohio, a grand jury's refused to indict white police officer Brian Mason for killing 13-year-old Tara King in 2016. King was an 8th grader who played football, was in the Young Scholars program at his school. He was playing with a toy BB gun near his home when Officer Mason chased him into an alley, allegedly confused the toy gun for a real gun, and shot the boy repeatedly, killing him. King is at least the second person Officer Mason has killed over the last 5 years. And in New Orleans, hundreds of people gathered to celebrate the removal of a massive bronze statue of Confederate General Robert E. Lee on Friday. It was the last of a series of Confederate statues the city's removed in recent weeks. Workers wore bulletproof vests and face coverings to conceal their identities as they used a crane to remove the statue from a 60-foot-high pedestal. White nationalists have staged a series of protests and issued threats in the lead-up to the memorial's removal. A car belonging to one of the workers had also been set on fire. And those are some of the headlines. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. We're back in New York City. In his first foreign trip abroad as president, Donald Trump traveled to Saudi Arabia this weekend, where he signed an arms deal totaling $110 billion. This comes in addition to the more than $115 billion offered in arms deals to Saudi Arabia by President Obama during his time in office. Speaking in Riyadh on Sunday, President Trump praised the deal.
This landmark agreement includes the announcement of a $110 billion Saudi-funded defense purchase. And we will be sure to help our Saudi friends to get a good deal from our great American defense companies, the greatest anywhere in the world. This agreement will help the Saudi military to take a far greater role in security and operations having to do with security.
The arms deal comes as the Pentagon continues to support a Saudi-led bombing campaign in Yemen, where years of fighting has decimated the country's health, water, sewage, and sanitation systems. Over 10,000 civilians have died since the Saudi invasion began in 2015. The UN says around 19 million of Yemen's 28 million people need some form of aid, with many of them at risk of famine. Trump mentioned Yemen twice in his speech, but only to first praise the Saudis for their war against the Houthis and then to condemn Iran for its support of militant groups. The arms deal includes tanks, artillery, ships, helicopters, a missile defense system, and cybersecurity technology. The deal also includes precision-guided munitions, which the Obama administration had stopped selling Saudi Arabia out of fear they would be used to bomb civilians in Yemen. Democratic Senator Chris Murphy condemned the arms deal, writing in the Huffington Post, quote, "By selling the Saudis these precision-guided weapons, more, not fewer, civilians will be killed because it's Saudi Arabia's strategy to starve Yemenis to death to increase their own leverage at the negotiating table. They couldn't do this without the weapons. We are selling them," he wrote. Meanwhile, the human rights arm of the American Bar Association has informed the Senate the arms deal may be illegal due to the Saudi atrocities in Yemen. Vanderbilt University law professor Michael Newton wrote, quote, "Continued sale of arms to Saudi Arabia, and specifically of arms used in airstrikes, should not be presumed to be permissible," unquote. Meanwhile, in another deal reached over the weekend, the Saudi Kingdom and the United Arab Emirates announced on Sunday they'll give $100 million to Ivanka Trump's proposed Women Entrepreneurs Fund. To talk more about the significance of Trump's visit to Saudi Arabia, we go now to Washington, D.C. to talk to Medea Benjamin, co-founder of Code Pink and author of the book Kingdom of the Unjust, Behind the U.S.-Saudi Connection. She wrote an article last week headlined 10 Reasons Trump Should Not Strengthen U.S.-Saudi Ties. Medea, welcome back to Democracy Now! Talk about Trump's trip to Saudi Arabia.
It's just appalling to see Trump in Saudi Arabia, Amy, touting this $110 billion arms deal. When you look at the history of how those arms have been used, you talked about their use in devastating Yemen. We also have the example of them crushing the democratic uprising in neighboring Bahrain, using those weapons to fund al-Qaeda groups in Iraq and in Syria, and using those weapons internally to crush dissent, particularly in the Shia areas, which is happening right now with the Saudi siege of the Shia town of Awamiya that is getting absolutely no press in the United States. So Congress does have the right, and I would say the obligation, to stop these arms deals. It didn't do it under Obama. It's time they do it under Trump. They'll only do it if we, the people, put pressure on Congress to say no weapons sales to the repressive regime of Saudi Arabia.
Mm. And the fact that these precision-guided weapons that President Obama, under enormous pressure from peace activists and others for selling this to Saudi Arabia, finally stopped, the fact that Trump has resumed these weapons.
Yes, he's resumed those weapons. Again, Congress could stop it. And he also will probably be giving the green light for the invasion of the port of Hodeidah, which is where the majority of humanitarian aid comes in. The humanitarian community says that will be catastrophic. So I think, once again, we have to put the pressure on Congress to say no green light for the invasion of that port. And in fact, what we do need is an emphasis on going back to the negotiating table, find a political solution to this crisis in Yemen, which is the furthest thing from what President Trump wants to do, because you could see from his trip to Saudi Arabia that this is all about encircling Iran. This is all about inflaming even further sectarian violence, which is what the U.S. has been doing by supporting the Saudi involvement in Yemen.
Why would the invasion of Hodeidah be catastrophic, as you say?
Because this is where the food comes in. 90% of the food in Yemen is imported. If they cannot get food into Hodeidah, which has already been hampered by the Saudi bombing of the cranes there and by a Saudi blockade of vessels coming in, but if they further destroy the ability to bring humanitarian aid into Hodeidah, it will result in a full-blown famine.
And cholera, the issue of cholera. Hundreds of Yemenis have now died because of the devastation of the sanitation system.
Half of the medical facilities in Yemen have been destroyed, again, in the significant, most of them by the Saudi bombing campaign. You have now an outbreak of cholera that is declared a national catastrophe in Yemen, where they're saying that now 1 out of every 10 minutes a Yemeni is dying from the effects of cholera.
Why do you think President Trump went to Saudi Arabia first, the first country in the world, his first foreign trip? Most presidents since Reagan have visited either Canada or Mexico as their first foreign trip.
Well, first, Amy, think of all the protests that would have broken out in Canada and Mexico with Trump's appearance. You didn't see one protester on the streets of Saudi Arabia because protesters would be arrested, flogged, beaten, tortured, and perhaps beheaded. So it was a, quote, friendly place for Donald Trump in that respect. He also wants to tout the weapons sales, and he talks about it in terms of jobs, jobs, jobs back in the United States. And he wants to, between the trip to Saudi Arabia and the trip to Israel, be sending this very clear message to Iran. And let's be clear, the best foreign policy achievement of the Obama administration was the nuclear deal with Iran. This is something that Trump may well destroy.
Speaking to CNN Sunday, Democratic Congressman Adam Schiff criticized Trump's position on human rights in his Riyadh speech.
I was also struck by the suggestion, and I think this is a broader element of the administration's policy, that they're going to de-emphasize issues of human rights, that what countries do within their own boundaries, we're essentially going to look the other way. That's not a high priority of ours anymore. The promotion of democracy, the promotion of human rights is going to take a back seat. I think that would be a terrible abdication of our global leadership when it comes to advocating for people who are the subject of persecution or imprisoned, or journalists that are thrown in jail, or people not allowed to practice their faith. I think it would be a historic mistake for us to walk away from that. And it was summed up, I think, most poignantly to me when Angela Merkel came to visit the president, when one of the headlines read, "The leader of the free world meets Donald Trump." That's not what we expect of our president, and that needs to be, human rights need to be, nonetheless, a top priority for the United States.
Medea Benjamin, the issue of human rights in Saudi Arabia.
It was quite ironic when Rex Tillerson was speaking at a press conference with the foreign minister of Saudi Arabia right next to him, and said that he hopes the people of Iran get the freedoms of speech and association they deserve. And a reporter said, "What about Saudi Arabia?" He wouldn't answer that question. So the selectivity is just astounding. I think going to a country like Saudi Arabia that has no free speech, no free association, no national elections, no political parties, no trade unions, where people like Raif Badawi, the blogger, is in prison for 10 years for blogging, where human rights lawyers are in prison for 15 years for defending human rights. It is appalling that Trump would go to Saudi Arabia and not even mention the issue of human rights, much less try to meet with one of the advocates for human rights while he was visiting Saudi Arabia.
I wanted to go back to some of the comments Trump made about Saudi Arabia during his campaign, when he frequently denounced Saudi Arabia. In a Facebook post on June 16, 2016, he wrote, quote, "Saudi Arabia and many of the countries that gave vast amounts of money to the Clinton Foundation want women as slaves and to kill gays. Hillary must return all money from such countries." In an interview with the New York Times last year, Trump also claimed that without U.S. support and protection, quote, Saudi Arabia wouldn't exist for very long. During a February 2016 interview with Fox and Friends, Trump accused Saudi Arabia of being behind the 9/11 attacks.
Who blew up the World Trade Center? It wasn't the Iraqis. It was Saudi. I mean, take a look at Saudi Arabia. Open the documents. We ought to get Bush or somebody to have the documents opened because, frankly, if you open the documents, I think you're going to see that it was Saudi Arabia.
That was Trump speaking in February last year on Fox and Friends. Medea Benjamin.
He said a lot of truthful things during the campaign that now he goes back on as soon as he is president. It is quite astounding to see him in Saudi Arabia, the very country that is behind the 9/11 attacks, 15 of the 19 hijackers, that is still trying behind the scenes to stop the ability of 9/11 families to sue Saudi Arabia in U.S. courts. In fact, has blackmailed the U.S., saying that it would pull out $750 billion of investments. And meanwhile, Donald Trump is trying to get them to invest more in the U.S. economy so they can continue to blackmail us.
And I wanted to go to another comment he made, going back to Donald Trump on the campaign trail at a presidential debate in October, accusing the Clinton Foundation of being a criminal enterprise for taking millions of dollars from Saudi Arabia and other countries.
It's a criminal enterprise. Saudi Arabia giving $25 million, Qatar, all of these countries. You talk about women and women's rights. So these are people that push gays off buildings. These are people that kill women and treat women horribly, and yet you take their money. So I'd like to ask you right now, why don't you give back the money that you've taken from certain countries that treat certain groups of people so horribly? Why don't you give back the money?
So that was Donald Trump in October in a debate with Hillary Clinton. Well, in another deal reached over the weekend, the Saudi Kingdom and the United Arab Emirates announced they would give $100 million to Ivanka Trump's proposed Women Entrepreneurs Fund. Medea.
It's the height of hypocrisy. If the Saudis indeed wanted to help women entrepreneurs, they should lift the guardianship system that treats women as minors their entire life. They should allow women to drive. They should stop the gender segregation that exists at every level of Saudi society, from the schools to the business places to places of worship. And to have Ivanka Trump meeting with Saudi women entrepreneurs and touting this new investment is absolutely ridiculous. Ivanka Trump could have met with the women who have been signing petitions asking for lifting of that guardianship system. She could have been meeting with the women who have been punished for trying to drive. Those would be good ways to help women entrepreneurs in Saudi Arabia. Interesting. Neither Ivanka Trump nor Melania Trump, the First Lady, were covered at the events and when Donald Trump spoke. Well, it's also interesting that they were the only women at the events. You looked out and you saw just a sea of men. And so I think there are so many things that Ivanka or Melania could have done, could have said, that would show solidarity with the Saudi women who are fighting and have been fighting for decades for their rights. And yet they didn't utter a word of support for those women. Medea, what role did Donald Trump's son-in-law, Ivanka Trump's husband, Jared Kushner, play in making the arms deal happen? Right before Donald Trump's trip, the son-in-law, Jared Kushner, was meeting with the Saudis to clinch this deal. And in fact, in what was described as a jaw-dropping moment, he picked up the phone to call the head of Lockheed Martin to negotiate a better deal for the Saudis. You wonder why the representative of the United States is trying to get a better deal for the Saudis instead of the other way around. But he made sure that deal would be ready by the time Donald Trump got there to announce the $110 billion deal.
And Medea, I want to ask you to stay with us. Medea Benjamin, co-founder of the peace group Code Pink, author of the book Kingdom of the Unjust, Behind the U.S.-Saudi Connection. She wrote an article last week headlined 10 Reasons Trump Should Not Strengthen U.S.-Saudi Ties. When we come back, she'll be joined by Trita Parsi of the National Iranian-American Council. Stay with us. I've Got the Power by Snap here on Democracy Now!, DemocracyNow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. As we continue to cover President Trump's trip to Saudi Arabia, I want to turn to his address to dozens of heads of state from across the Muslim world Sunday. When Trump was in Riyadh, Trump said they should unite in their fight against terrorism in a battle he characterizes between, quote, good and evil.
This is not a battle between different faiths, different sects, or different civilizations. This is a battle between barbaric criminals who seek to obliterate human life and decent people, all in the name of religion. People that want to protect life and want to protect their religion. This is a battle between good and evil. But the nations of the Middle East cannot wait for American power to crush this enemy for them. The nations of the Middle East will have to decide what kind of future they want for themselves, for their country, and frankly, for their families and for their children. It's a choice between two futures, and it is a choice America cannot make for you. A better future is only possible if your nations drive out the terrorists and drive out the extremists. Drive them out. Drive them out of your places of worship. Drive them out of your communities. Drive them out of your holy land. And drive them out of this earth.
Donald Trump singled out Iran as a state sponsor of terrorism during his Riyadh speech. He called on all, quote, nations of conscience to isolate Iran.
Starving terrorists of their territory, of their funding, and the false allure of the craven ideology will be the basis for easily defeating them. But no discussion of stamping out this threat would be complete without mentioning the government that gives terrorists all three: safe harbor, financial backing, and the social standing needed for recruitment. It is a regime that is responsible for so much instability in that region. I am speaking, of course, of Iran. From Lebanon to Iraq to Yemen, Iran funds arms and trains terrorists, militias, and other extremist groups that spread destruction and chaos across the region. For decades, Iran has fueled the fires of sectarian conflict and terror. It is a government that speaks openly of mass murder, vowing the destruction of Israel, death to America, and ruin for many leaders and nations in this very room.
We're joined now by Trita Parsi, founder and president of the National Iranian American Council, author of the new book, Losing an Enemy, Obama, Iran, and the Legacy of Diplomacy. Still with us, Medea Benjamin, co-founder of Code Pink, author of Kingdom of the Unjust, Behind the U.S.-Saudi Connection. Trita Parsi, if you could respond to what President Trump said in this first foreign trip he's made, his first trip to his first country, Saudi Arabia.
I think it's quite regrettable that right after the Iranian people went out, and despite all of the undemocratic obstacles they had to overcome, they nevertheless managed to choose the most moderate person on the ballot, the person who had vowed to continue to try to open Iran up, to continue to negotiate, to be able to resolve conflicts in the region, and actually wants a better relationship with the United States. Donald Trump's response to this is to clench his fist and call for Iran's isolation. I think it's also important to recognize that this is not just rhetoric. This is not just something that we can dismiss, mindful of the many things that Trump otherwise tends to say. Here we're seeing two building blocks being put into place that can lead to an absolute disaster. The combination of a policy of isolation and rejecting diplomacy, together with a policy of regime change, because in that speech he also called for regime change, is exactly how the Iraq War started. Late in the 1990s, Congress passed the Iraq Liberation Act that made regime change in Iraq official policy. It was combined with an isolation policy, and all it needed was a spark in order for that to lead to a military confrontation. Donald Trump, perhaps not knowing so, is now laying the groundwork for that type of a conflict at the request of the Saudis.
I wanted to get your comment on Rex Tillerson, the Secretary of State, saying he hopes Rouhani's re-election will mean a dismantling of Iran's network of terrorists and the restoration of human rights. The significance of Tillerson, of course, President Trump, making these comments from Saudi Arabia.
Well, it's fascinating because on the one hand, the administration said that we're not going to focus on human rights any longer. But when it comes to trying to find anything to attack Iran with, then, of course, it's been thrown out there again. And for it to be said from Saudi Arabia, where the human rights situation is worse than it is in Iran, obviously is not helping the human rights situation in Iran. In fact, this is exactly what the hardliners in Iran would like. It is so easy for them to dismiss what otherwise is legitimate criticism against Iran's human rights record when it is said from Riyadh and when it's said with this degree of hypocrisy and double standards. It's actually undermining the human rights situation in Iran when it's done in the manner that Rex Tillerson did it.
I'd like to turn to a 2009 diplomatic cable released by WikiLeaks on Saudi Arabia. The cable, which was written by then Secretary of State Hillary Clinton, said, quote, donors in Saudi Arabia constitute the most significant source of funding to Sunni terrorist groups worldwide, unquote. The cable went on to urge senior U.S. government officials to, quote, encourage the Saudi government to take more steps to stem the flow of funds from Saudi Arabia-based sources to terrorists and extremists worldwide. Trita Parsi.
Well, this trip is not about fighting terrorism. If it was, we would have actually seen much, much firmer position by the United States against these funders in Saudi Arabia, who actually also provided the seed funding for ISIS. Instead, all of the focus is on Iran. Why is that? Well, the reason for this is, beyond the fact that the Trump administration is securing these arms deals, is that there are elements in the Trump administration and certainly people in Saudi Arabia and in Israel who want the United States to once again adopt a position of hard hegemony in the Middle East. They want the United States to be completely responsible for the security of the Middle East, meaning that the United States will have to uphold it and pay for it through its own treasure and blood, which would obviously then benefit Israel and Saudi Arabia and some of those states that are allied with them. This puts the United States in direct confrontation with Iran, who opposes American hegemony in the region. The question that is not being asked in Washington, D.C. is, what is the, if one were to assume that there is such a thing as a benefit of hegemony, what is the benefit of hegemony for the United States in a region this chaotic? What is the benefit of being responsible for the security of the Middle East when it is in such chaos? And what would the cost of that be? Those are questions are not being asked. All the focus tends to be how many potential jobs $300 billion of arms sales will provide. $300 billion of arms sales will only lead to further destabilizing the region, which then the United States would be responsible for. The cost-benefit analysis of this makes absolutely no sense, but the question is hardly discussed.
Trita, new Senate sanctions against Iran are scheduled to be marked up in committee this week. What is your message to Congress in the wake of the Iranian election?
Well, as the Senate bill stands right now, it actually is a violation of the JCPOA, the Iran nuclear deal from 2015. And I think it would be highly problematic if members of Congress, particularly on the Democratic side, vote for this, arguing that this is not a deal breaker and something that would violate the JCPOA, and then in combination with what Trump is doing right now, further would put us on a path towards a military confrontation with Iran. They don't have the ability to say, well, we didn't think this would lead to this, as they could have said when they voted in favor of the Iraq Liberation Act, or later on when they voted in favor of the Iraq War. It's very clear what this bill will do as it stands right now. And I think the message to Congress from the American people has to be absolutely clear. They supported the nuclear deal. In fact, the nuclear deal is now more popular amongst the American public than it was 2 years ago, because they've seen that it actually works. And it would be a disaster if Congress, and particularly if Democrats who fought so hard to save this deal, now actually pull the trigger and kill it.
And the people's response in Iran to the election of Rouhani, what you think this means?
Well, Iran is now one of the very few countries, certainly in the region, perhaps beyond the region, in which the population 3 times in a row have voted in the most moderate person that existed on the ballot. Very few countries in the region can say this. In fact, if you take a look at Israel, for instance, last time the moderates won a landslide in Israel was in 1992. And for them to now see the reaction by the United States to this election result, an election result that very much was about continuing the outreach to the West and continuing the outreach to the United States, is deeply disappointing, to say the least. I've spoken to a few people who felt that the jubilant mood after Rouhani's victory suddenly took a turn for the worse once they heard Donald Trump's speech in Riyadh.
And Medea Benjamin, the ramping up of tension with Iran, and of course we see it with North Korea as well, and President Trump, not that he was that different from President Obama, or was he, when it came to Saudi Arabia? How many trips did President Obama make to the kingdom? Something like 4 trips.
Not only traveled to Saudi Arabia, but authorized 42 different deals totaling $115 billion. But on the other hand, he started at the very end of his 8 years to reconsider, to pull back U.S. support for the Saudi bombing in Yemen, to put a halt on some of those weapons. And now Donald Trump is doing just the opposite. But I want to say, Amy, that the people of the Middle East are desperate for solutions, and the people of the United States don't support continued U.S. involvement in the wars in the Middle East. Donald Trump said he needed a good relationship with Russia to start dealing with the problems in places like Syria. Well, he also needs a good relationship with Iran. So I think our message should be that we need to stop the proxy wars between Saudi Arabia and Iran in the Middle East. We need the countries of the region to all come together, and Donald Trump should be focusing on finding solutions, not inflaming the tensions.
Well, Medea Benjamin, I want to thank you for being with us, co-founder of Code Pink, author of Kingdom of the Unjust, Behind the U.S.-Saudi Connection. We'll link to your piece, 10 Reasons Trump Should Not Strengthen U.S.-Saudi Ties. And thank you to Trita Parsi, who is head of the National Iranian-American Council, author of Losing an Enemy, Obama, Iran, and the Legacy of Diplomacy, which is out next week. This is Democracy Now! When we come back, you may have seen the video of protesters, not in Turkey, but in Washington, D.C., being beaten by security guards, pummeled, kicked in the face, a number of them hospitalized. Well, we'll talk about what happened And what will happen to the Turkish ambassador? Some are calling for him to be expelled. And the U.S. relationship with Turkey, as it was shown that the Turkish president visiting D.C. at the time, President Erdogan, looked on. Stay with us.
Adama aşık oldum, aşık oldum hasarı delik deşik ne kan ne bozu aralar gri bütün ömrü ben bir adama aşık oldum, aşık oldum. Başka gezegene ait suyu başka rengi başka adamları korkak kaçemi kovuyor her gemi. Bulutlar kıyar toprağa düşüyor kaldırımlara. Ölüler aşık olmaz ki ama o da aşık oldu bana.
Goya Shoakil here on Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman as we end today's show looking at Turkey's crackdown on protests, not in Ankara or Istanbul, but here in the U.S. Last week, the Turkish president, Recep Tayyip Erdogan's security detail assaulted a group of peaceful protesters outside the Turkish ambassador's residence. Video from the scene shows Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan looking during the assault. It is not clear if he gave the order for the attack. Among those assaulted by the Turkish security detail were American diplomatic security officers. Police briefly detained the assailants, but released them after learning they held diplomatic immunity. The assault came shortly after Erdogan was welcomed to the White House by President Trump. During the meeting, Trump did not mention Turkey's deteriorating human rights situation, which has seen nearly 50,000 people and 150 journalists arrested since a failed coup last summer. On Sunday, Secretary of State Rex Tillerson denounced the violent clash during an interview with Fox News Sunday's Chris Wallace.
We did call the ambassador of Turkey into the State Department to discuss what occurred with them and express our view that this is simply unacceptable. There is an ongoing investigation, Chris, and I think we'll wait and see what the outcome of that investigation is. But we have expressed our dismay at what occurred at the Turkish embassy.
Well, for more, we go to Washington, D.C., where we're joined by two guests, both eyewitnesses to last week's violence outside the Turkish ambassador's residence. Saeed Reza Jassimi was violently attacked during the protests, rushed by ambulance to the hospital where he received stitches on his nose, was treated for a head injury. His assailants knocked out one of his teeth and loosened several others. Jassimi's a businessman who's been a U.S. citizen since 1992. And we're joined by Rukin Isaac, a Kurdish activist, Ph.D. student at the University of Maryland, Baltimore County. She attended last week's protests and wrote a piece for the Huffington Post that was headlined, "Will Erdogan's thugs face no consequences for attacking us on U.S. soil?" I want to welcome you both to Democracy Now! Saeed Reza Jassimi, explain what happened to you. Tell us about the scene that day.
Well, we went to like 14 of the citizens of the American, we are American citizens. We went to Turkish ambassador's house to protest Erdogan. We wanted to hear our voice. We are not happy the way his dictatorship. And as soon as we get there, the police, we just follow the DC police orders, and the DC police send us to cross the street. And when we were there, right away, the people in front of the Turkish ambassador's house, they start to curse us, they start to use F words, and then our slogan was very peaceful. It's not violence whatsoever. We were demanding peace in Turkey, and this is our slogans. Erdogan is a baby killer. The ISIS and Erdogan is the same. ISIS made in Turkey. Please, Mr. President Trump, stop Erdogan, because Erdogan is attacking the Kurds. Kurds fight ISIS against ISIS, and the Turks fight Kurds. So we wanted to Erdogan hear our voice. That was the reason we were there. But 10-15 minutes later, and first they attacked, and then the police stopped them. Some civilian, they attacked, police stopped them, and then like 5-10 minutes later, the Erdogan bodyguards, they passed the police the block, and then they attacked us very barbaric way. And first I remember there was a woman next to me, Lusik, she's a SED representative in Washington. They attack her, one of them is grabbed her head and they started punching. And I tried to cover her head, and then all of a sudden, 3-4 of them attacked on me, and I found myself on the street. And then they were kicking one after another my head. I tried to get up, but they were kicking me, so I realized that I cannot. And I lay down on the floor, and I tried to cover my head with my arm, and I could have died. I don't know how long I stayed there. I lost it, and then all of a sudden I realized no one around me, and I tried to get up, and I saw I was bleeding, and then some police officer, they came and they raised me up, and they moved me towards the circle.
I wanted to ask Rukin Isaac, what did you see and at that site on Tuesday in front of the Turkish ambassador's house?
Well, I arrived like 5 minutes later. There were 2 attacks. The first one happened when I already arrived there. It was like 5 minutes after that. And my friend's daughter, 7 years old, Cheyenne, she was crying when she saw me. I took her, and then with my son, 4 years old son, I took them to we were like 6 feet behind the 10 people, and I was trying to soothe her. All of a sudden, I saw this man in black suit. They were just they were rushing into my friends. And first I thought, no, they will not come to attack us. Police will stop them. But then I saw they furthered, and then they came close to me. They couldn't grab me, but they grabbed one of my friends. You might have seen her picked photos in media. He was put on a headlock position, and I felt very guilty after that, because I couldn't protect her, because I had my kid with me, 4 years old son. And I've been saying that I was there with my son because we've been to the protests in DC for a long time. I've been here for 10 years, and I take him to every protest. It is because we never got involved in any violence, and it is just usual for the Kurdish community here to take their kids, even pregnant women. Sometimes they come to the protests. So, and I tried to when I saw my friend was punched by one of these men in black suit, I tried to run away to the opposite direction, and I saw that there was a door open, and it was later I realized that it was the Kenyan embassy. I asked them, can I come in? They told me you'll be safe. The American police is here. I said they couldn't protect us. First I thought they didn't protect us, but then after watching the videos, no, actually they couldn't, because they outnumbered, and I think they had guns. The Erdogan's bodyguards, they had guns, and I'm sure that the sea police was startled too. They couldn't do anything against them.
Mm-hmm. Who are these security? And first off, Erdogan, video was released, newly published video that shows Erdogan looking on as members of his security detail assault the group of peaceful protesters. What are you calling for now? And did you see Erdogan looking on?
Well, I didn't see him, but like I wouldn't be surprised if he gave the order, because in Turkey he's the person who is calling all the shots in Turkey. He's ruling everything. Like he's in charge of everything in Turkey, not just the politics, but the judiciary. He is the head of the universities. He is everything in Turkey. So I wouldn't be surprised that he gave the order.
He's just extended the state of emergency in Turkey on Sunday, Rukin Isaac. And what are you calling for now? The men who were arrested apparently have diplomatic immunity, and so they were released. What are you demanding? On Fox, they asked Tillerson, Chris Wallace asked Tillerson if the U.S. would be expelling the Turkish ambassador. And Secretary of State Tillerson said there needs to be an investigation.
Well, I want to say that this is not the first time that his bodyguards are attacking protesters. This happened in Ecuador last year, and also it happened at the Brookings Institute in Washington, D.C. again in 2016. Well, they get away with that, and because of that, I guess they think that they can do whatever they want in other countries. They do that in Turkey. Like I wanted to say that this violence that we witnessed on Tuesday, we can take it as a representation of the Turkish state violence against dissidents and opponents in Turkey. But the scale of it was the amount of the violence that we witnessed was nothing to be compared to the ones that people are having on a daily basis in Turkey. So yes, McCain called for the expulsion of the ambassador. I think they should do something, and especially this new government, especially Mr. Trump, the president, he is more patriotic, and this happened in American soil. So I hope they will do something, and they need to do something actually, because they get away with that. They get away with the one in Ecuador the last year. That means that this is a recurring thing that's happening.
Rukin, do you think that Trump's position on Turkey, calling when Europe was condemning the referendum that Erdogan pushed through that would increase his dictatorial powers, do you think Trump is influenced by Mike Flynn, his former national security advisor, who turned out to be a paid foreign lobbyist for the Turkish government?
Well, actually, yeah, sorry.
Go ahead.
Is someone going? Well, actually, they basically have links with the Flynn that we saw that, but I don't. But Turkey's stance against Turkey is always like this. They don't want to upset Turkey. This is how I see it, because I think it's a very important ally in the Middle East. And I don't think that they wanted to break their ties with Turkey. Yeah.
And Saya, do you plan to protest Erdogan anymore after you were brutally attacked and hospitalized?
Absolutely, absolutely. Whenever I have a chance, I'm not going to give it up. As an American citizen, I have a right. It's our First Amendment to protest, to have a peaceful protest whenever and wherever we want. Mr. Erdogan cannot take away this my right as a Kurdish from Turkey. This happens in Turkey. It shouldn't happen in Turkey either. But
we have 5 seconds.
As an American citizen, it's not acceptable. It is not acceptable.
Saad Reza Jassimi, I want to thank you for being with us, and Rukin Isaac, PhD student at University of Maryland, thanks so much for joining us. For people who are listening on the radio, you can watch the video at DemocracyNow.org. That does it for our broadcast. Democracy Now! Produced by Mike Burke, Dina Guzder, Nermin Sheikh, Carla Wesler, Agadis Dino, Sam Alcoff, John Hamilton, Robbie Karen, Honey Massoud. I'm Amy Goodman. Thanks for joining us.